for the developing embryo. It's very rich in fats, which is why that a lot of people don't eat egg yolks. They just eat egg whites. Okay? It's very rich in fats, but it's got a lot of protein in it, and it's got other nutrients in it as well. Of course, the big thing you hear about is cholesterol issues. When you get older, you'll worry about this. But if you have free-range chickens, their yolks are much lower in cholesterol than caged ones. So, anyway, they're very rich in proteins. And they can be just a small part of the egg, or they can be a huge part of the egg. So, only about 20% of the egg in passerines is yolk. But in a kiwi, which is a large ground bird, it doesn't fly very much, if at all, is 70%. Okay, and part of this is because of size. The kiwis are much larger, so they're going to have a big protein source. And the yolk is actually, you're not going to notice it by looking at it. Okay, but if you could do a cross-section of it, you would see that there are alternating layers of yellow and a lighter yellow, maybe even whitish yolk. So the yellow yolk is put on during the daytime when they're actively feeding and so forth. And the lighter yolk, the white yolk, it's not as rich, and it's put on overnight. Okay, so when they're not feeding and so forth. So it's still putting yolk on, but it's not quite as rich at night, and so you get these alternating layers. And I have a diagram in a bit that will show that a little better. So fertilization occurs in the oviduct, okay, but you start out with this yolk deposit. That's deposited first, okay? Then you have fertilization, and then we move on. Because we get eggs that aren't fertilized and we eat those eggs all the time. That's what we eat. So the egg still develops. Okay. So this is just a diagram to show you some of the variation in the amount of yolk. So some of the ducks are about 50-50 compared to a lot of the passerines, which are those very small. Terns are in the middle there, and so forth. Okay, the embryo, the developing embryo sits on top of the yolk. So it's sitting basically on its nutrient source. And it's held in place by this gelatinous kind of string type thing, gelatinous albumin, I call it a chalazé. I don't know what the proper pronunciation is, but I like that Frenchy sounding one. The chalazé. Now this is really important though, because it allows rotation of the yolk in the egg. If the egg is moved around, the yolk can rotate, but it keeps it pretty stable in place. So it's not bumping all around the egg, but it can rotate. Then we also have the yolk sac called the vitelline membrane. That's going to surround the yolk and keep it from separated from the albumin. And the albumin is the white of the egg. So when we look at the albumin, the white, it is like 90% water. and some proteins. So it's very watery, but it does have proteins in it. And so, therefore, one of the big things it does is provide water to the embryo. And, of course, important for development. You've got to have the nutrients, but you've got to have water. It also cushions the embryo, since it is surrounding the yolk. And this is going to be important as the eggs get bumped around and moved a little bit and so forth, to have that cushioning effect in there. And another function that is very important is the fact that it reduces cooling when the parents get off the eggs to go eat or so forth. Okay. So it's an insulating membrane and keeps the egg warm and makes it cool much slower when the female or male is not on the eggs. And lots of things will force one of the birds off. Usually it's some kind of disturbance can do that, although they set pretty tight a lot of times, but disturbance can do it. Again, feeding, and if both parents aren't involved, the female has to eat, so she'll go out and feed and leave the eggs. Okay. All right. So we have the diagram here, and you've got the embryo that sits on top of the yolk, and this is the yolk right here. And then the yolk sac, the vitelline membrane, surrounds the yolk. Then you've got all the albumin out here. Notice there is an air sac at the bottom of an egg. If you're chicken eggs, it's that bigger flat end. And then we'll talk about some of the rest of these as we go along. All right, so that's kind of the beginning. But how do we get there? We've already talked about this several times, so I'm not going to spend tons of time on it. But the testes, remember, only swell during the breeding season. And an interesting thing that we see in a lot of different animal species is that the sperm can change if it thinks there's sperm competition. So the greater the sperm competition, they can produce more sperm, they can produce larger in this case. So the relative size, I mean, it's not going to like double or anything, but the relative size is going to increase with the possibilities of sperm competition. So you're going to need your ABC thing. So the question is, who is going to have the largest relative testes size and sperm size, relatively speaking? Okay. Monogamous birds, socially monogamous birds, polyandrous birds, or elect species? Okay. Which one is going to have the largest testes and relative sperm size? So let's see a vote. Okay. All right, there's quite a mixture. Convince your neighbor.
What'd you say? But look at the one eggs, right? So in polyandry, the males incubate the eggs. Well, that's what I was thinking. I couldn't remember. So you're looking at probably I'm not sure what that species is.
And then the polyandry said one male and one female.
No, there's a bunch of females and one female. Polyandry, you can take laundry. I always remembered it.
Whatever
When the
works.
female acts like the male, right? Or the male acts like the female.
Yeah, that's it.
Squad is my barn.
Yeah, so then I
my
go
bar,
with the social.
in my garden, you guys, once they're done nesting, once they're done.
It's illegal.
Collect nests.
Well, I gotta, once they're done nesting, you gotta be tore out.
All right, bring it in. Bring it in. Okay, let's vote again. Which one has the largest relative testes or sperm size? Okay, let's vote. I'm still seeing a big variety of answers. All right, so anybody want to talk about monogamy, why they think that that's going to be the largest? Social monogamy. There are a lot of bees, so somebody, why would that have the largest?
They have multiple mates.
Multiple mates. Okay. The male has multiple mates. Does the female have multiple mates?
Possibly.
Possibly. Okay. What about polyandry?
There's one female and a lot of males, so there's more competition between the males, so the male sperm is going to be bigger.
Okay, so this is a case where the female, remember, she's the one that the male does all the sitting on the eggs. So there's lots of males trying to mate with one female. Okay. What about elect species? Anybody want to talk to that one?
Are those like prairie chickens?
Uh-huh.
I chose that one because they're all like competing for females, and so they want to be bigger and stronger.
Okay, so it's males. In a lek area, you may have multiple males trying to compete with the females. However, the females are coming in and choosing one male. They choose the male. Okay? All right. Any other thoughts?
So C.
Pardon?
Is it C?
Are we gonna talk about it?
Yeah, right here. Okay. So the relative, oops,
Wait, what? Luck is the smallest?
because again, you may have multiple males there, but the females come in and choose one of them. The males are so busy displaying.
So it's
They're displaying, but the female chooses.
it's more physical features that attract the females. And
Right.
So therefore, you don't have, the males don't have to produce larger sperm.
Exactly. They are dancing and they're showing off feathers and displaying and doing all kinds of stuff. And that's what the female chooses. Okay? So she chooses one out of maybe a set of them in an area. Okay. Solitary monogamy. It's bigger than the lek because there is multiple matings. There can be multiple matings. You know, males come in and mate with a female, but still it's likely to be one male. Remember it's the last male too. So it's the partner male that will probably mate the most with her. Colonial, obviously it's potential. Okay, colonial is the kind of the social, but you can have multiple matings going on. But polyandry is the big one because it is the female chooses. Okay, but she's got so many males trying to mate with her because she is the colorful one and the one that displays a little more and so forth, that there's going to be multiple matings. So the likelihood of sperm competition is greater. Okay, the likelihood. So sperm also looks different according to species. So in passerines, which is this one right here, D, and some of these others are too, but they're very long and straight. Okay, in the non-passerines, they're very long and straight. Okay, and the passerines tend to be kind of spiral, both the head of it and the tail of it. And I don't know what the adaptation is for, but that's just the variety that there is.
Do we need to memorize these shapes and things of sperm? Okay.
Just know that passerines have spiraled and non-passerines tend to have longer and straighter. Okay. So what happens then when the testes have enlarged, they're producing sperm, and so now the seminal vesicles, kind of that's the sperm storage area, okay? The seminal vesicles will swell, and they create this cloacal protuberance. Cloacal protuberance. And what it is just the cloaca sticks out, okay? And when we ban birds, okay, we provide no, whatever. We're blowing on the feathers to separate them so we can look at the size of the cloacal protuberance. And that tells us what breeding state they are in. So we give them a 1, 2, or 3. And a 1 is just a little bitty bulge. A 2 is more like a volcano, kind of. And then a 3, you have they're really swelling, and then you have the protuberance there, which is kind of what that one is. So they've got the protuberance coming out. So this is the seminal vesicles that are swelling with sperm. So a 3 is, they are, not to be crass, but they're primed and ready, okay? They're ready to go here with a 3. And so this one shows the bulge at the bottom here, okay, with the top. So they go through these stages and we rate them, and that helps us target when is that breeding season for this species. Okay? And some species will mate more than once. They'll lay more than one clutch, so they'll have 2 kind of main breeding areas if they do 2 clutches. The females lay 2 clutches of eggs, obviously 2 mating periods. So we can see when those are by judging the size of the cloacal protuberance. So we know that birds do not have external genitalia. We already know that. So it is contact. And the sperm is transferred on contact, and both of the cloacas evert a little bit. So the males obviously everts, okay? And then the females does too, just a little bit. And so they literally just touch each other, and they exchange the sperm, and they call it the cloacal kiss. So now to show pictures, and a lot of this is going on right now. You'll see birds, and it looks very awkward, but it doesn't have to take a long time because they're just doing the cloacal kiss. You can imagine the long legs there.
She's like, I was going to eat and think of anything.
All right. So a few species have a penis-like organ, but most of these are some ducks, chickens, some parrots. Okay, so ducks, chickens, and a few parrots, and there's others as well, but have a penis-like organ, but it doesn't operate the same way. All right. So now we've had fertilization. And so now we're going to get ready to lay the egg. And they put on the shell of the egg. There's several layers of the shell. Now remember, a lot of birds will lay eggs even if they're not fertilized. Okay, so we put on the shell of the egg. The outer layer, the one we're familiar with, is that hard calcium carbonate crystals. And it's in kind of this lattice of collagen, so that makes it very strong, relatively speaking, of course. But think about an eagle or some of these bigger birds, like that condor and so forth, ostriches. They sit on the eggs, so they have to have this hard calcium carbonate layer. back in the 60s is when they realized that DDT and another whole suite of chemicals, they kept the birds from laying down this calcium carbonate layer, and so the parent would actually lay the egg but then crush it when they sit on it. And so that what happened in the 60s with Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring, because nests were failing, so she talked about wouldn't it be awful to have a silent spring with no birds. But the nests were failing, and they noticed it the most in the larger birds because they're heavier and so forth, that their eggs were not forming that calcium carbonate layer. And it was the DDT and related chemicals that were keeping them from depositing this calcium carbonate. So that was a big step in the development of the EPA, was her book, looking at that. There's also two flexible inner membranes that are important. So there's an outer shell membrane that actually sticks to that hard layer, the calcium carbonate layer. And this provides a little more stability with the rest of the egg. Okay. So it kind of connects that hard layer with the inner parts of the egg and provides a little more stability. So the outer shell membrane. The innermost shell membrane is in contact with the vascular layer, okay, which is called the chorioallantoic membrane. Chorioallantoic membrane. This vascular layer, of course, is just like our vascular system, in that this is where the air exchange takes place. So the respiration is occurring here. They're getting oxygen and trading carbon dioxide. So both of these have a function that is important to the development of the egg. Excuse me. So here's some diagrams. This one is the egg, and this one shows you the yolk with that alternating layers of the dark yellow and light yellow, the day yolk and the night yolk. Right? So then we'll take a clip out of it. So this is the outside of the egg. Here's that collagen lattice work with the calcium carbonate crystals. First of all, note that the eggs have pores in them. The shell has pores, and this allows the movement of the gases as well. So the pore is important there. You come in and you've got, here's the outer shell membrane. This is attached, okay, to the shell. The inner shell membrane, okay, is next to or attached to the chorioallantoic membrane, or the vascular, which is next to the vascular membrane. So all these layers stack up here. Vascular area, okay, the chorioallantoic and allantoic, the shell inner membrane and the shell outer membrane, and then the hard shell, okay? So they all have really important roles when it comes to development. Questions? All right. Most eggs are laid one a day. One at a time. So it could be one a day, it could be one this week, one next week, one every 3 or 4 days, whatever. Why only?
It's very energetically expensive.
Incredibly energetically expensive to produce the egg. You're producing the yolk, okay, with lots of proteins in it. You're putting the shell on. So that takes a lot of energy to do. What else? The weight of the egg. Remember, we talk about birds that fly, so they have to be able to fly. So the weight of carrying multiple eggs would be too heavy. And so they lay one at a time. One a day, again, they may have several days between them, but only one at a time. So it takes time to produce them, and then this flying efficiency because of the weight issue. One cool thing is to a certain extent, the female can control the size of the egg and the quality of the egg. Now, no hummingbird is going to put an egg out like a chicken egg, so we're not talking that kind of size control. But we are talking that they can increase the size a little bit of the egg. And with that goes the quality of the eggs. And in many cases, we're talking about the yolk. They can put on a little more yolk, has more proteins in it, the more carotenoids, so it's darker, richer yellow. And they usually try to do that when they mate with a lower quality male. So for some reason, they did not get the attention of the higher quality males. It may be the habitat area, it may be that they're a monogamous species or whatever, and they didn't get that high quality male. So they can try to increase the volume and the yolk a little bit, the overall volume and the yolk. So it's not like huge differences, but they can try to compensate for the potential of mating with a lower quality male. So then we have the process. Here's where the ovum starts to develop, and then it comes down, and then there it is fertilizing the oviduct, and they come down and just add layers, keep adding layers, and then till the egg is ready to go. Okay, so eggs. Eggs are just really beautiful, and there's just so much variety. When you think about the base colors, like this one, okay, and you got blue, and then you've got specific patterns, they are really diverse and really beautiful. And this actually started a field of study in the Victorian oology, which was the study of eggs. And so that's when they went out and did a lot of egg collections and things like that, period. They are really pretty. There's such variety. And you'll notice the shape differences as well. I know you've talked about this in lab a little bit. But you've got more round eggs, and then you've got really pointed eggs, and everything in between. So, what influences the pattern? Let's see what you remember from lab. What influences the pattern? And this could be the color and the pattern. What influences that? Is it camouflage, mimicry, recognition, egg quality, or all of the above?
I don't feel like it's all the above, but it's more like
Let's vote. E is the white side. Okay. All right. It's almost all white. So I think everybody is pretty much showing that. It is all of these reasons. Now the one that everybody's going to say first is camouflage. Okay. But we have white eggs as well. So it's not always camouflage. But let's look at a killdeer nest. Camouflage is important for certain species. Okay. There it is. Pretty easy to spot, right? Well, what about this one? Is it easy to spot? Anybody see it?
Right in the center, isn't it?
Right dead center, right there. Okay. Now, I have had killdeer that I see them, I see where they're setting, I see them fly away, I walk up there and I cannot find the nest. Okay, I cannot find it, even though I know it's there. Yes?
Do cowbirds ever lay on them?
No, it's pretty rare. Because, first of all, they're a lot bigger than a cowbird egg, so. All right. So, they are very camouflaged because of where they nest. They're ground nesters, and so forth. We have some at the field station, and it always nests on the driveway to the first house, and so we tend to go down once we see them there, and we put all these little flags and barriers around it to try to keep people from driving over it, but it's always right in the middle of the driveway. And then here's another one, and I put a circle around it, but the egg is, one of the eggs is right there. You can see him. So they're very camouflaged, and that is important. You want to match surroundings, especially if you're a ground nester a lot of times. So mimicry, we've talked about this a little bit. Mimicry is important, especially if you are going to parasitize another nest. And so like the cuckoos here, the cuckoos' eggs are variable between individual birds. They can be. But each individual will usually match another species. So depending on which species they're likely associated with and likely to lay their eggs in, they'll mimic that particular species. So, but in this case we can spot it because of the size, but they are very close in pattern and color to the species that they choose to lay the eggs in. Now they don't like choose a different species every season or anything like that and switch their eggs, but they have one species that they've adapted to parasitize. It's also important for egg recognition. Now think about a colony of seabirds that you've just got thousands of birds nesting in the same place, and they fly off to eat and come back. They have to be able to find their nest, and they do it a variety of ways, but one way is egg recognition. And so there'll be subtle differences between eggs that they can recognize. You and I may not look at them and see a lot of difference, but they can do that. So egg recognition. It's also, so in a crowded colony, that's one. It's also important to, you want to be able to tell them apart from brood parasites like the cowbird, but also egg dumping. So again, so that you aren't stuck with a bunch of, we talked about coots will dump eggs and so forth, that you don't want to raise a bunch of chicks that are not your own. They don't have your genes. You don't want to waste your energy. So if you can recognize your eggs, you can get rid of them. Do they always? No, but they can. So these are the cowbird eggs. You see it's not really matching pattern or color or anything. And in fact, they're usually bigger. But by recognizing that some species, we've already talked about this a little bit, some species will try to throw the egg out or kill it. Others will just accept it because the potential to lose your whole nest to the parent cowbird coming back and destroying it. Okay? So it just depends on the species. Yes?
For egg dumping, would it be younger females more likely to accept another bird's eggs?
That's a really good question, and I don't know the answer to that one, but that's a definite possibility, okay, because they either don't want to or raise their own, or they're just not as ready to raise their own, so to speak, not as good at it. And then here's the egg dumping. This is a typical coot nest, and then you can see nests like this, okay, with lots of dumping. But some will just sit on all of them and hope that they come out. Others will try to get rid of some of them. And we've already talked about the Ruthonitaries and how they'll take the eggs or because they'll be destroyed. But coloration can also be a signal to quality. And this is to judge the quality of the female and the potential offspring. So it may be more brightly colored or more patterned, have more speckles on it or something like that. But it's not always the case that the best looking egg is the best quality egg. Sometimes they put, it's the opposite, and I don't know why. Okay. But it can be an indicator of the quality of the egg. And it may be that part of the food source helps with the colors of the egg, the pigments, but and so you put more on when you got a good food source. Okay, let's let's start hatching. All right, we already mentioned there is an air space in the egg. So, hatching begins when they can't exchange gases properly anymore. So a lot of times it's the size of the chick, and they're just not very efficient at exchanging gases. So they start by pushing up against the membrane there at the airspace. And to break that membrane, then they can get a little more air out of that airspace. But that's the beginning. So there's two temporary anatomical features that help them hatch. One is a hatching muscle on the back of their neck. And it's a bigger muscle, and then they use it to kind of push through the egg. So it helps them, once they kind of get a crack in the egg, they use that to push their way out a little bit more. And the other one is an egg tooth, right on the tip of the beak. It's just a little protuberance that they can use to scrape the inside of the shell to kind of reduce some of that calcium carbonate crystals and then push their way through. So the egg tooth is an important, but they're both temporary. So the muscle will decline, the egg tooth will either wear down or drop off. So it's piercing, they use the egg tooth to pierce this membrane for the airspace, as well as to kind of scratch and weaken the shell a little bit, and then pushing through. So the process of hatching is called pipping. And that can take a while. You know, they're not super developed, so it takes a while for them to push through the shell. It can take a few hours to even, for some species, a day or more, maybe even a day or two. The parents will sometimes help and pick pieces off to help them get out, but not always. And then the parents will usually brood the chicks at a minimum until they're dry, which is just sitting there, again, helping them maintain the temperature. Because a lot of chicks don't have the ability to thermoregulate immediately. So until they're dry and can thermoregulate, the parents will continue to brood them and sit on them. So that condor I showed you at the beginning was still sitting on the chick and brooding it to keep it warm, even though it hatched yesterday. It may have even been the day before. So they're still going to help them thermoregulate. They get their down feathers fairly quickly, but until they do that, it's harder.
What do the chicks do for food at that time?
Okay, the parents are still feeding them, but it could be it's more of digested food that they're bringing up, that they store in their crop and bring up, so it's partially digested. Like doves and so forth produce that crop milk, which is that sloughed skin kind of layer, and they will feed them that at the beginning as well. All right, I'm going to stop there for today. So we'll finish up the development of the chick and some of the incubation stuff on Thursday.